Good morning and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our online seminar. Today, our topic is Japan-U.S China Triangular Relations, the limits and the possibilities of a great reset. Japan-U.S China Triangular Relations have been a source of economic growth since normalization in the 1970s. Today, this triangular relationship will steer an engine of economic growth and synergies is being challenged by strategic competition between the U.S. and China. Economic security concerns associated with weaponization and monopolization of trade and supply chains, and geo-technological competition. Today, Professor Stephen Nagy will argue that we are witnessing recalibration of the relationship, and it's being pulled toward three directions. The first, a Sino-centric reset based on the dual circulation and the Belt, Road, and Initiative of China. The second direction, a US-centric reset based on competition, cooperation, and resistance. And the third, a middle pathway with countries like Japan crafting an economic security policy that aims to balance engagement and deterrence with China through a complex mix of multilateral relationships. The end destination of this trifurcation is yet to be written. However, Japan's middle pathway may gain traction with other middle paths and associations that wish to continue to benefit from economic engagement with China while preserving their strategic autonomy. It's my great pleasure to have Dr. Stephen Nagy as the speaker of today's seminar. Dr. Stephen Nagy is a senior associate professor at the International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan, a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, and a visiting fellow with the Japan Institute for International Affairs. His recent funded research projects are Sino-Japanese relations in the wake of the 2012 territory disputes, investigating changes in Japanese business, trade, and investment strategy in China, and perceptions and drivers of Chinese view on Japanese and US foreign policy in the region. He is currently working on middle power approaches to great power competition in the Indo-Pacific region. After his presentation, Professor Nagy will be joined by Professor Dr. Eberhard Sandschneider. Professor Sandschneider is a partner at BGA, Berlin Global Advisors. From 2003 to 2016, he was the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, one of the leading European think tanks. Since 1998, he has held a chair in Chinese politics and international relations at the Freie Universität Berlin, Germany. Between 1995 and 1998, he was professor of international relations at Johannes Gutenberg Universität in Mainz, Germany. As an author of numerous books, Professor Sandschneider is a much sought-after speaker on global risks and frequently appears in German and international media. Professor Sandschneider's comments will be followed by a free and open discussion. Our audience will have the opportunities to ask Professor Nagy and Professor Sandschneider questions and make comments. This seminar is expected to last 1.5 hours. Please be aware, today's discussion is recorded and the video will be published in wenshe.substack.com. My name is Chaoting Chen. It's my great honor to be the moderator of today's seminar. Together with other friends, I have founded an online community for humanities and social science, Wenshe. We want to promote the academic exchanges between the students and the scholars in the fields of humanities and social science. I'm a PhD candidate at the Freie Universität Berlin, Germany, Currently, I'm working on the comparative study of China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States. That's all. Professor Nagy, I look forward to your wonderful presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chao Ting, and thank you very much, Professor Sunschneider, for joining today and willingness to share your comments. And thank you very much to all our participants on today's Zoom discussion. I strongly encourage as much dialogue and constructive engagement as possible. We're here as colleagues and friends. Before I start, I just want to send my prayers to the people in Ukraine. Watching what's happening there is really shocking, whether I'm based in Japan where I am, or of course where you are in Germany or other parts of the world. Let's hope that a peace can come very quickly to Ukraine and a sense of normality can return to that part of the world. I'm going to get ready to share my screen. So just be patient. So just to, as the screen warms up, hopefully everybody can see the screen. Great. I want to just put into perspective Japan-China-U.S. relations. Some of you may know, or some of you may not know, Japan exported last year about $210 billion, that's US dollars, to China. And this happened at a time when bilateral relations were probably not at their warmest. Actually, if you look at the Genron poll, unfavorably ratings in Japan of China were very, very, very low. But trade relations continue to deepen. The United States as well continues to have deepening trade relations with China. And I think the figures are about $530 billion a year. And those figures also increased during the pandemic and during this growing turbulence between China and the United States. And I think these trade figures are really important for us to start this discussion because it demonstrates that in the case of Japan, their bilateral relation, about 30% of their trade goes to China. They can't decouple from China. It's their neighbor. They have to find a way to work with China. The United States is geographically distant. Its trade partners are much more diverse. And most of its trade is centered in North America rather than in this part of the world where I'm based. So their calculation when crafting an Indo-Pacific strategy is much different. Of course, China is a trading nation. It trades with the world, it trades with Japan, it trades with the United States, and its economic growth is very much related to enhancing those trade ties. And without enhancing those trade ties, of course, development and social stability back home will be challenged. So with that background, today I'd like to just talk about the triangular relations between these countries and the limits and possibilities of the Great Reset. And I think that is really important, and that's my take-home discussion today, is that despite the deepening strategic competition between the United States and China, I think that there are definite limits to how much decoupling can take place and will take place. And there are definite limits to a Great Reset. With that in mind, I have several objectives today. I want to introduce what I call the great power visions of regional order. And I'm going to do that first contrasting the United States and China. And then I'd like to introduce what I think is called the free and open Indo-Pacific middle way, or a middle power way of trying to think about how to balance those trade and security interests within this region, and why I think countries, middle power countries like Japan, are really, really significant actors in terms of crafting a different route that moves away from strict strategic competition between the United States and China, and thinking about how middle powers can create a little bit more space for them to negotiate and shape the strategic competition between these two great powers. In order to do that, I'd like to touch upon the commonalities and differences of all these three systems. I'll introduce some key lines of inquiry. And then lastly, I want to talk about their visions in terms of regionalism and what does it mean for regionalism. Contrasting, I think, what we call a non-legalistic, non-binding approach to regionalism that's built on relational politics that we'll talk about, and a more legalistic approach that is more binding in nature. And of course, I'll give a discussion and a conclusion in today's presentation. So the first contrast I think is really important for us to be looking at is really how are China and the United States visualizing regionalism within the region, and their contrasting views of how the region should develop. On the right, you can see I put the BRI. I think the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, is really based on relational politics, and most of us. So I think when we look at the BRI, it really focuses. I think it's built on the premise of relational politics, and I think many of us who understand, who have studied a bit about Chinese foreign policy, understand that China is more comfortable with building relations and having relations with its neighbors, and those relations are not binding. They're not legalistic in nature. Rather, they're based on long-standing historical ties, economic ties, and I think in many ways an understanding of the benefits of accepting a hierarchy within a Sino-centric sphere. The BRI is really understood from many different perspectives. One of my colleagues, Huang, in 2016 talked about it as China's economic ambition, aiming to stimulate economic development and really trying to create a vast geo-economic region that links Asia, Europe, and Africa. And in many ways, through those 5 corridors, land corridors, and the sea corridor, China has really created the sinews that have binded and linked much of the Eurasia continent. Others talk about it as a global Chinese contribution to global good based on the principles of economic liberalism, in that China is trying to help other countries develop by providing infrastructure connectivity, opening up their economies, and creating synergies. Still others, like Swain, talk about it in terms of desecuritized relationships that leverage China's growing economic power and influence to strengthen and expand cooperative interactions. And still others really talk about it in terms of an indirect strategy to regain regional predominance without directly confronting the United States. The key take home when I think we're trying to understand the BRI is that it's a provision of public goods, it's a geo-economic strategy, and it's built using infrastructure connectivity to build a vast economic network with China at the center, and it stems out throughout the region. The United States Indo-Pacific strategy, on the other hand, really, I think, has not shifted dramatically from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. Under the Biden administration, there is an area of competition, cooperation, and rivalry. And if we take a look at it, the most recent February 2022 Indo-Pacific strategy, some of the key themes that come out is that the Indo-Pacific strategy is focusing on rules-based relations, international law, and the rules-based order. And you can see how this contrasts with the regional politics or the regional theory of relational international relations that Chin Yat-chin has talked about, and how the BRI really is a non-binding kind of mega project. And I think this is the first really strong distinction between these two initiatives. And when we take a more granular look at the United States Indo-Pacific strategy, you can see that it's focusing on applying this international law, not only to the seas, but the skies, and in general, how the Indo-Pacific region is governed. So this really flies in the face, I think, of China's 5 principles of peace of coexistence, talking about sovereignty, non-interference, mutual respect. And I think that this creates a certain tension between these two visions for the region. We see that the US strategy is also focused on rule setting in critical areas of emerging technology and internet. Again, this speaks to this idea of rulemaking and a rules-based order, which contrasts, I think, how China has engaged in its regional politics through the BRI, which is, again, through these non-binding agreements. We see that the United States Indo-Pacific strategy is built on alliances and in close partnerships with its closest partners, where the BRI is really focused on this idea of win-win relationships and mutual respect. How that plays out in practice, that's a different story. But again, we're talking about rhetoric. We're talking about how policy papers are talking about their particular ideas. And lastly, we see that the United States is couching their Indo-Pacific strategy really through this idea of competition. And I think what really demonstrates how the United States is thinking about this is the American Competes Act in 2022. And if you do have time, I encourage you to take a look at it. But really, one of the key take-homes of this document is that it explicitly states that it aims to strengthen the competitiveness of the United States economy and US businesses and counter anti-competition actions by China. So we see that the Indo-Pacific strategy that has been emerged out of the Biden administration really isn't much different than what emerged out of the Trump administration, except there is an area of competition. We've seen that it move away from regime change or talking about the Chinese Communist Party and more focused on competition and cooperation. So the take home from these two visions really is BRI, relational politics, non-binding, using infrastructure to and connectivity to create economic ties to the region. Again, there's lots of different views about the BRI within China. The official view that it's a win-win form of international cooperation. Even Chinese skeptics will talk about it in terms of building asymmetric dependencies in terms of economic relations within the region. The US, on the other side, on the other hand, is really focused on this rules-based process, and we'll come back to this. So let's look into another vision. And again, I think other vision is this middle way or a middle power way. And you might be saying Japan is a middle power. If we look at the Lowy indexes, Asian Power Index, comparatively at the comprehensive level, Japan, India, Vietnam, and most other countries that we would consider advanced countries or moving up the ladder in terms of power really are middle powers in terms of the way they act, in terms of their resources, and what they can do in terms of competition within the region. In this case, Japan is a very good example of a middle power. It's focused on norms, it's focused on institution building, it's focused on buttressing international law. Now, when we look at the free and open Indo-Pacific vision that's being offered by Japan as a third way, rather than this solely securitarized rules-based approach by the United States or the relational approach by the BRI, there's lots of different views. Michael Green from CSIS talks about it in terms of trying to preserve an order that has benefited Japan's development over the past 150 years. And that's high quality rules for trade, investment in infrastructure, and preventing coercive action on smaller states. Others, such as Kei Koga from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, talks about the primary objectives of FOIP as really consolidating a regional order on the basis of existing rules-based order. So that's deferring to international law. Others have talked about focusing on maritime security and ensuring that sea lanes of communication remain open and rules-based, because these are the key arteries that transport imports and exports in and out of the Indo-Pacific, but are also they're really the fundamental tools or laneways that provide for prosperity for most of the countries within the Indo-Pacific. And still others, such as Professor Hosoya from Keio University, who's at Cambridge University right now. So if you're up in that part of the world, I encourage you to say hello. Talks about FOIP in terms of a comprehensive, inclusive, and cooperative vision that's not dominated by a security agenda. And I think this is one of the key distinguishing features of the US Indo-Pacific vision and the Japanese or the middle power Indo-Pacific vision, is that countries like Japan really can't securitarize their Indo-Pacific strategy. They have too much economic complementariness with China. And as a result, they have to find ways to cooperate, but also and engage, but also balance some of the challenges and hedge some of the challenges associated with China's rise. So when we're looking at these, the commonalities between some of these initiatives, of course, is they're focusing on infrastructure connectivity to provide public goods. These initiatives are really trying to enhance each state's respective security through economic instruments. But the major differences, I think, include a continental versus maritime orientation, with the BRI primarily continental, although there is a maritime aspect of the BRI. Where the Indo-Pacific strategy that's advocated by the United States or middle powers such as Japan and Australia and Germany and likely Canada in the coming months really focus on the maritime domain and again, institution building and ensuring those institutions are transparent and rules-based. Some of the differences, I think, again, the BRI is a geopolitical tool to reconfigure the region. And I think this is something that Chinese scholars will privately discuss. It's a tool where the United States and even the Japan proposal is about maintaining the current rules-based regionalism. So we see a tension. One is reconfiguring the region, and one is to try and maintain a rules-based region. And this tension between these two are really something that where we're seeing competition emerge. The other differences, of course, is this relational aspect of the BRI versus that's non-binding versus the Japanese or middle power legalistic developmentalism approach, and the United States approach, which is legalistic, but primarily securitarized in terms of how it's visualizing its Indo-Pacific strategy. So if we're trying to understand this through IR theory, and I think most of you are on the call understand something about international relations, I think there's two useful models to try and get a better understanding of these three directions in terms of the Indo-Pacific. The first one is this idea of a rational legalist perspective. Here, Yao talks about it in terms of institutional architecture, focusing on formal organizations, institutional design, and building the efficacy of regional institutions. And if we're thinking about the Indo-Pacific region, really there's a paucity of rules-based transparent institutions that are legally, that are bound through binding agreements. So this rationalist legalist approach really focuses on rules-based agreements. And I think when we look at both the United States Indo-Pacific vision and the middle power, the Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific vision, there is a strong element of rules, a rational legalistic perspective in understanding these initiatives. In contrast to this rationalist legalist perspective, there's something that we call the process-oriented perspective. And here, I think it fits very well with the BRI's relational approach to building partnerships through the BRI. It really focuses on developing shared norms and practices through consultation and dialogue, something that China continues to preference. It's aligned with its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, in that it highlights sovereignty, it highlights non-interference, and it highlights a so-called win-win approach to engaging in international relations, but in a non-binding manner. And scholars such as Achaya talk about this as an exercise of identity building facilitated by an avoidance of grand institutional designs, and that the adoption of consensual a consensual and cautious approach. And again, this is, if you're thinking about adopting a consensual and cautious approach, relationships are really important. And I think that these two theories really are interesting tools to try and help us understand these 3 different frameworks for thinking about regionalism within the Indo-Pacific and across Eurasia in general. So this kind of leads us to 3 broad questions that I think we can be thinking about in terms of today's discussion. And one is that, is there an interaction between these 3 models? And I would argue absolutely yes. And this is probably good. Competition for the market of ideas ensures that the better ideas will bring the other initiatives forward to adopt similar principles. Why has each initiative changed its trajectory? I think it's also very interesting for us to be discussing, and I'll touch upon that in a little bit. And lastly, how can we characterize these competing initiatives? So working backwards, I've talked already about how we can characterize these competing initiatives, with the American, US Indo-Pacific strategy really being legalistic and security focused, the BRI being relational focused, and using geoeconomic tools to reshape regionalism. And the Japanese are the middle power focus, which is really about balancing the economic security and some of the security challenges within the region through developmentalism, through infrastructure connectivity, through a non-zero sum approach to how it's engaging its partnerships within the region, but still wedded to this idea of a rules-based approach to how we engage in international relations. And I think this is critically important as we've watched what's happened in Ukraine, where international law has not been observed in terms of sovereignty and the conflict that has emerged in Ukraine. So as we look at these three initiatives, I think that they're still moving, they're still evolving, and they're being shaped by each other. I mentioned the interactiveness of these three approaches. If we look back in 2015, former Prime Minister Abe gave a speech in India to the Indian Parliament, talking about the confluence of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. He talked about the synergies of this region. And he started this process of building a free and open Indo-Pacific vision. I think that this initial vision was looked at by our Chinese friends, and they saw that this was a potential challenge to how they understand regionalism within the region. And as a result, they put forward the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative, to try and create a Chinese model of regionalism within the region that is built on Chinese values and how China understands regional politics within the region. The Chinese model was further, I think, incentivized or gathered momentum because at that time, the former President Obama firmly rejected China's ideas about a new model of major powers or great powers to try and diffuse so-called Thucydides trap. So we've seen an interaction with these two. And as the BRI came online and we had the first Belt Road Forum, we saw China really gather adherents to the BRI. And Japan stepped up to the plate, and it offered, and it transformed its four principles to focus on fiscal transparency, environmental sustainability, infrastructure connectivity projects that are not linked to geopolitical objectives. And if we reflect upon the Second Belt Road Forum, much of the rhetoric of the Second Belt Road Forum adopted similar rhetoric. So we see these two initiatives interacting with each other and influencing each other and competing with each other, which is very interesting to watch. In contrast to the BRI and Japan's FOIP, I think that the US Indo-Pacific strategy, or however we want to call it, is really out of step with both the BRI and Japan's FOIP vision, in that it's really not focusing primarily on the provision of public goods. It's still primarily crafted and visualized in terms of security, talking about competition, talking about cooperation, and still talking about rivalry with China. And as a result, I don't think the Trump Indo-Pacific strategy or the Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy really has been able to adopt some of the driving or the characteristic features of either the BRI or Japan's forward vision or middle power vision. And if we look at some of the other middle power visions that have emerged, whether it's Australia, whether it's Germany, Denmark, and again, where I'm from, Canada, that's coming out, they are much more reflective of the Japanese model of the free and open Indo-Pacific, in that they think that securitizing the relationship with China and the competition with China is not a productive way of shaping the region. But at the same time, they understand that middle powers such as Japan or Australia or Canada or Germany need to be key players in ensuring that the strategic competition between the United States and China really isn't the primary factor that is going to shape this region's competition, its economy, and the strategic challenges moving forward. Lastly, and I think importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic has not halted this interplay between these initiatives. And I think this is something really, really interesting for us to be looking about, in that all the countries that are thinking about this particular Indo-Pacific region have now brought in health infrastructure, the so-called Health Silk Road, and trying to contribute to the region in terms of public goods, in terms of helping relieve the challenge and overcome the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. But that being said, the key principles of Japan's middle power approach to regionalism is continue to remain centered on a rational legalistic approach to broad-based cooperation within the region, a less securitized approach, an approach that focuses on developmentalism and infrastructure connectivity. Beijing's approach has not changed either. again, this process-oriented, non-binding, sovereignty-centric, and exacting goals remains characteristic of BRI initiatives within this region. I must say, though, that the BRI model is challenged today because of the closed borders associated with COVID-19 and growing mistrust. As we move forward, it'll be interesting to look where these initiatives move. We see FOIP already creating new pillars, focusing on new partners they can work synergistically with, as well as using minilaterals like Quad, but also the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative that's come out between Australia and India to provide other forms of public goods to the region. The Indo-Pacific strategy out of the United States continues to be security focused. And the security focused IP will challenge, it will limit how much partners within this region can cooperate with the United States. I mentioned the damage that I think COVID-19 has done to the BRI model. That may change moving forward. We may see resources being diverted to the digital infrastructure aspect of the BRI, but still its characteristic features will continue to be focused on non-binding agreements. Lastly, and I think importantly, when we're looking at these three agreements, these three kinds of visions for this region and how they're playing out and competing and interacting with each other, I think that the US model, of course, is being influenced by the domestic politics in the United States and now distracted by the challenges that are occurring with Ukraine and Russia, and real concerns about the sustainability of the current administration in the White House. In the Chinese context, this economic slowdown, power transition or continuation within Zhongnanhai will shape the BRI moving forward. And we see that the BRI is having more questions are being raised about the BRI, whether it's South Central Asia, whether it's South Asia, or even in African states, about the not only about the benefits that BRI can bring to these states, but whether the benefits are for the elite or for the ordinary citizens in the receiving countries. And lastly, Japan's FOIP, or middle power approach, really will depend about leadership. And I think that the Japanese over the past 2 years have not had the same kind of leadership as they had under Prime Minister Abe in terms of 8 years of very strong statesmanship. And Japan's middle power approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific has lost momentum. And we've seen that in the most recent Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey of Southeast Asia, in which Japan's level of trust has decreased. And I think this is very much related to the lack of engagement within the region over the past 2 years. So these three visions moving forward really are going to be limited by domestic politics, by how much resources they can divert to these regions, and how much buy-in they can get to these regions. The challenge for middle powers like Japan is if they can work with other middle powers to really create a critical mass of countries that can really deliver public goods to the region, deliver and create stakeholders to the region, and build partnerships within the region that are not primarily securitized, but still can create a buffer and insulate middle power states from the strategic competition between the United States and China moving forward. I'll stop there, and I look forward to Professor Sandschneider's comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Nage. Professor Sandschneider, would you please make some comments?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. First of all, Stephen, great presentation. I agree with most of what you said. In the context, you said it. But what I'm asking myself is, how does this context fit to the first question we got in the chat? Will China attack Taiwan? That's a different world. And what I do not see reflect, if you would give this would have given this presentation, say on February 22nd, we would immediately have started debating BRI and all the initiatives. But don't you think that February 24th changed the world much more radically than reflected in your approach? What I see in your approach is a very substantial description of the history of regionalism and of different concepts of how to run the world in the second decade of the 21st century. 2 weeks ago today, this world changed. We are back, believe it or not, in Cold War 2.0. Just take Belt and Road. I always, Mr. Chun will remember, I always told my student, this is the achievement of China, that we talk again about Eurasia. We never did for 40, 50, 60 years. Due to China's Belt and Road Initiative, we were thinking Eurasia from the Western Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. And are you aware of the fact that this war might stop the one key element of Belt and Road, the Northern Railway connection? As soon as finally the borders between Belarus and Russia and the European Union closed down, that's an end to this element of Belt and Road, not necessarily to Belt and Road, but certainly to this very important aspect of Belt and Road. A rules-based global order, as is the dream of the United States and basically also European countries, the West, so to speak, is history. Rules were broken militarily 2 weeks ago. And for the time being, if I'm watching Western strategic debates, you are of course focusing more on the Asian perspective, but in a Western European and American perspective, rules-based, it's more or less gone. It's confrontational again. And everyone is waiting for China to position itself towards this war in Ukraine. But the problem for a moment is not China. Whatever will be happening, and we have interesting developments as we speak today. The Ukrainian president, for example, indicating that he's willing to give up Crimea. Wow, that's a major step. But it could be a step out of the war. Whenever that happens, and we all hope you send your prayers at the beginning of your presentation, I certainly join you in that respect. Whenever this war will be over, the dramatic effects of the war will not be over. Russia will be a pariah nation, will be isolated in a Western perspective at least, and will be forced to turn east to China. And in China's perspective, of course, Russia is a welcome junior partner. But junior, I'm not sure whether Mr. Putin had this idea when he started all this, but in the Chinese perspective, it is of course China which forms, in a geopolitical perspective, the heartland of the world island, as our classic authors would have described this. So the challenge for me is, what effect does this war in Ukraine have generally on world order ideas? We have a German author who once wrote a book entitled The World Without Order. That is a typically transatlantic misreading of the world, because it says only our order is a good order. Only the rules-based order is something we can accept. And as you demonstrated, there are other ideas, not only Chinese ideas, also from middle powers, but for the time being, power politics, including the threat with nuclear weapons, is back on stage in international relations. And I have a gut feeling that this might dramatically change also these more cooperative and institutional approaches to understanding, well, different aspects of how best to run the world. And if I may, Mr. Chen, I would certainly like to give my personal answer to this question we already have in the chat. Will China attack Taiwan? I have been watching Chinese strategic behavior for 4 decades now, and my impression is China is watching closely what is happening in Ukraine for good reasons, which brings me to a very relaxed and hopeful aspect for the Taiwan issue. China can see on a daily basis what people's support for an army can do to an even much bigger and better weaponed army. And the big thing is, of course, that the Taiwanese army obviously is one of the best armies in South and East Asia. So in a Chinese perspective, you can see that this is not easy, militarily speaking. It is an island. It is highly professional in its military capacities. It has the Taiwan Relations Act support of the United States, which Ukraine has not from NATO. So for the time being, I would argue people in Taiwan can never be sure, but that is a situation existing since 1949. But for the time being, I do not expect any major irritation in the Taiwan Strait, except for coincidence by clashes which could happen anytime. That is a continuous risk. But in a systematic perspective, I would say China will be absolutely busy in reorganizing its global strategy based on the fact that China will be the only major power supporting Russia in the future. That's quite obvious, while Russia will be the pariah of nations in a Western perspective. And that also changes, of course, approaches to cooperative behavior in international relations. In Germany, you see a 180-degree U-turn of our government in terms of military, security, and relations to Russia. We had our present president, when he was foreign minister, thought in terms of modernization partnership with Russia. That is gone, and it will be gone for years to come. That is the dramatic change which is taking right now. And I'm not sure how you would build this catastrophe in international relations into your system of approaches towards regional cooperation, Steve. I'll leave it at that, and I'm certainly expecting questions from the audience. Thank you, Mr. Chung.
Thank you, Professor Zander Schneider. So, Professor Nage, do you have any response to Professor Zander Schneider?
They're great comments, and I'd like to just start with making a distinction between, I think, Russia as a great power and China as a great power. Mm-hmm. And I think that fundamentally, we shouldn't put these in the same box. Russia's economic integration into the EU was relatively, and into the global international economy was, however we describe it, was light or not substantial.
Almost non-existent, yeah.
Exactly. And its prosperity is not very much linked to the international market. And right. I think that this fundamentally creates a different calculus when we're thinking about the Chinese. China is a global trading superpower, and that it relies on a rules-based trading system to maintain that economic prosperity and that economic growth that it's enjoyed for the past 40 years. The Chinese Communist Party prioritizes social economic stability at home, right, growth at home, and delivering economic public goods to its citizens. And its citizens have become accustomed to that. Right. And in my understanding that I don't think China and the Chinese government is willing to risk the instability that could come from a conflict in this region of fundamentally trying to overthrow the regional order within this region or the global order in the same way that Russia has, because it has much, much, much more to lose. It would be much more consequential. So in a sense, I think that watching what's happened in Europe from the Chinese perspective is extremely concerning, as Russia's behavior will, of course, disrupt the regional order in Europe. It has unleashed the fears about a nuclear conflict, and and it's demonstrated how much, I think, influence Western countries have, whether it's the United States working with the EU, Japan, and others, on the international financial system, on how the international system works, which is primarily rules, and how these can be used as a tool to push back against belligerent behavior. And we've seen these tools being used on Russia. They're going to continue to step up on Russia. And I think that they're going to have a deep impact on Russia. And I agree with you fundamentally that this will isolate Russia. It will make Russia angrier. It will make it more belligerent, and that we're going to need to work together to contain that belligerence.
Yeah.
But I don't see China falling into this category for the reasons I said. It's much more dependent on the international system that it's mostly satisfied with. Of course, there's elements of the rules-based system it's not satisfied with, especially in its backyard, but its prosperity is very much linked to that international system and stability that comes from it. And this leads me to the Taiwan question. I think Taiwan is safe for the next couple of years because of domestic politics in the Chinese context. There's no way anything's going to happen before the 20th Party Congress or the 2023 National People's Congress. The economy is slowing down, and I think the Chinese have watched how the United States and EU and other countries have systematically brought the Russian economy to a halt, and that these tools can be brought to bear on China. And this is too much of a risk for what has been built in China in the past 40 years. So I think that, yes, we've had a fundamental shift in how we think about global order, but in other ways, it's demonstrated how important order is for economic sustainability and growth and prosperity. And that is something that not only China prioritizes in this region, but all the states. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, I have a slightly different interpretation, and I separate what's happening with Russia and what I think is going to happen in this region with China.
Wow, that's indeed the interesting question. In my reading of China's different behaviors, abstaining in the United Nations while supporting the strategic partnership with Mr. Putin on the other hand, doesn't seem to fit together. But my explanation is, as you just said, China is fearing that the negative fallout of economic sanctions between the West and Russia might, of course, in addition to an already weaker economy, have a negative impact on China. And we certainly agree that this Communist Party is basing its legitimacy on its ability to create economic welfare. And there is where these China has to make these two ends meet, and that is extremely difficult. The advantage of being able to force Russia into cheap deliveries of oil and gas are certainly not as high as the risks of these geopolitical or geo-economic impact. Absolutely agree. Yeah. Just of course, on Taiwan, we're obviously on the same side. Yeah.
I wanted to just add to that, and I think an important addition to thinking about how China is thinking about the region and how it's crafted its foreign policy over the past really 70 years is that it's made a constant attempt to allay the security concerns of all its neighbors. Not very well, but that has been its systemic approach in the region, to try and build economic relations, to try and decrease the challenges that I think are faced between the regions, and try to build broad frameworks of how they should engage in their bilateral relations, whether it's with Japan or Korea or other countries, and to not so much worry about the so-called pressure points like the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands or other issues. I don't think they fundamentally shifted from that position, because I think they understand that shifting from that position would drain resources from the priority, which is continuing to build the social economic system that they've built for the past 40 years. I just see that a shift in that.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Zanshede and Professor Nagy. You have made an in-depth analysis, both theoretically and very concrete, especially on the current international situation. So I would encourage our audience to raise questions or make comments. I think this is a golden opportunity to discuss with two scholars and experts. Anyone wants to ask any question or make comments? Okay, please, Lynn.
Yes, Lynn, yeah.
Yeah, hi, good evening. Yeah, thank you, Professor Stephen, for your presentation. Actually, I'm working on a research about Japan approach to the South China Sea. So I think your presentations today really helped me to my research with my research. And there is one argument that I heard from a quite well-known Japanese scholar about Japan's economic ties with China. And he said that like Japan does not necessarily depend much on its economic ties with China, because it can seek or search for other economic opportunities, like with Southeast Asian countries or Australia or India. So I think that you make like strong argument that like Japan cannot contain China because of its heavy economic ties with China. So I'm wondering that in case that Japan has to make a decision, in theory, do you think that like Japan can survive if it's cut economic ties with China? Because what I'm seeing here is in the Russia-Ukraine situation, and Japan makes really strong protest and also apply economic sanctions against Russia, a very strong move, right? But I think that China is also challenging international rule in the East China Sea, South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. So I'm wondering that, what do you think if Japan can really make a decision if it has to cut economic ties with China?
Thanks, Lynn. So I think what we've seen over the past week, today, the Americans have said they're not going to buy Russian oil anymore. But our German friends did not say that. Our German friends still need Russian, not yet. They still need Russian fuel to get through the next month or so of European winter. Can they do it? It depends if they can have an alternative energy source. I think alternative energy sources are possible, but expensive, and they need partners. This is inevitable. It's going to happen over 5 or 10 years. But will Germans and the Europeans be able to withstand the cost over that period of time? I say yes, but it'll be painful. In the Japanese context, Japan's population is declining. Its overall GDP is declining year by year because of the demographic challenges. It's less competitive year by year because we have an older population and less dynamic entrepreneurs. So losing, let's say, $210 billion, and I'm just talking about the China market, I'm not including Taiwan or Hong Kong, is a significant chunk of Japan's exports. And Japan is an export superpower. And it's not just that it's exporting to China, but Japanese things are made in China by Chinese with Japanese technologies for global export. So the benefit of that relationship is not just the things that they're selling to the Chinese, but it's the things that they are made in China for global export. And that's going to continue to increase. Importantly, and I think it's not just the Japanese Business Federation called the Keidanren, or the AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the German Chamber of Commerce, all of these chambers of commerce, if you look at their annual surveys, they all want to stay in the Chinese market. They have complaints about the Chinese market. They want better rules, fairer competition, but they want to stay in the Chinese market. So we have businesses that want to stay in the market, countries that depend on the taxes of those businesses that want a relationship with China. So I think it's really, really difficult to separate. What they can do is selectively diversify. But how much they can selectively diversify will depend on if there's other markets that can suck up the volume. So Southeast Asia has been impacted very negatively by the COVID-19 pandemic, which means the consumer power has probably decreased. India, similar challenge. They have the population, but they don't have the consumer markets. Korea, well, it's saturated. Taiwan is saturated. Hong Kong is in a mess right now. Australia is too small. So where do you pick up the consumers to make up for the loss of the Chinese market? And I just don't, my math is not like Einstein math, but you don't have to be Einstein to understand you can't make it up.
Yeah.
What about Professor Sandschneider? What do you think?
Absolutely, absolutely agree. China is a different story. It's too big. I'm just giving you an example from the German small and medium-sized companies' perspective. They are asking themselves, if we are coming under pressure from the United States, where do we give up 40% of our overall turnover, in China or in the US? If you have to give up 40% of your overall turnover, that kills your company. This is not about gains, that's turnover. So you're going down the drain as fast as you can. So China is a different story, as Stephen just said. Russia is, in a German perspective, if I may add that, it's oil and gas.
Yep.
You have a little bit in machinery, a little bit in consumer goods, but all these companies easily retreat from the Chinese market without risking their future. But if we would do that in China, just think of our automotive industry. Without the Chinese market, they are bust. So China is a different story, and that, of course, also leads to a different kind of foreign policy or foreign trade behavior. And especially from a German perspective, as you said, Japan is a foreign trade economy. So are we, at least we believe we are. No, we still are, no? So China is one of the most important global economic players in our perspective, and that also changes the security perspective of this country. Absolutely agreed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, because our topic today is about like China, US, and Japan triangular relations. So the very first question that's come up to my mind is China is one of the largest trade partners of Japan, while the US is a very important ally for Japan's security. So, but China and the United States compete each other in almost every field, I think, from security to economy. So I'm wondering, like, what is the Japan position if inevitably, if it has to choose between the two countries? Because in my country, I also have like that kind of question. So what is your view about that?
So Lynn, I think there's a lot of things to unpack there. So first you talked about competition between the United States and China. Yes, there's an economic competition there, but if you look at the number of patents that the Americans produce and how much money comes from those patents compared to how many patents the Chinese produce and how much money comes from those patents, you will be shocked. I think the United States makes something like $4 or $5 trillion from its patents, but the number of patents is maybe 20% of the Chinese. But the Chinese monies that are being made from those patents are almost nothing, like $800 million, which suggests that it's easy to make a patent, but something that's transformative, that is a global product, and they're not there yet. They may emerge in 20 or 30 years or however, but you really need to drill down into the qualitative aspects of the economy and economic, their size. China is also 1.4 billion people compared to 350 million Americans. But the 350 million Americans are getting richer every year compared to their Chinese colleagues. And again, this talks about productivity and something that you haven't maybe learned in, but it's called total factor productivity. Americans are hugely productive, where our Chinese friends are not. And actually, the Chinese total factor productivity is decreasing because of many, many domestic constraints. And the so-called quest for common prosperity is going to make that total factor productivity even less so. So I think we got to be very careful with that. And based on this qualitative difference in the economies, that I think that Japan will continue to work with the United States, not just because it's the most powerful country, but since World War II, actually since Japan opened up in the Meiji period, it's developed deep and comprehensive partnerships at all levels of American society, government, education, sister cities, even in Hollywood movies. If you watched Kill Bill, it's Japanese culture everywhere, right? And again, this really represents the deep, deep, deep relation that's comprehensive. And I think that this is something that you can't underestimate the ties of that relationship. And the Koreans are the same. And I want to just emphasize how important this is. The former president of the United States, as you know, was not the most what's the best way to put it? Diplomatic president. And the Japanese knew this. The South Koreans knew this. The Australians knew this. The Canadians knew this. And do you know how they managed the 4 years of the Trump administration? They complimented him in the White House, and they used all that comprehensive network to strengthen the relationship, to insulate the relationship from that president. The Chinese don't have that capital. And whether it's Trump or whether it's Biden, I don't think they have the ability to do this because they don't have a comprehensive relationship in the same way that Japan and Korea and other allies have made over the past 70 or 80 years.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other question or comments from audience? Probably I have one question or observation from my side. I think today we are discussing a fundamental issue for the relationship between economy and politics. I think before the war in Ukraine, it's really very difficult for middle powers like Germany and Japan to make a choice between economy and politics. But after the Ukraine war, I think suddenly everything has changed. This is really a game changer. I remember before the Ukraine war, it's really difficult for Germany to make a decision about Nord Stream 2, right? But after the war, Germany has immediately stopped this project. And the Western countries have immediately exclude Russia from SWIFT. So now between China and US and Japan and Germany, on the one hand, there is very close economic and trade ties. But on the other hand, there is growing geopolitical confrontation and ideological conflict. So in the past, I have the question, does the economy determine the politics or does the politics overwhelm the economy? But now it seems to me that it's quite clear. Politics, especially geopolitics, is much more important than economy because geopolitics is about security and survival of the country. I think Germany has made a very clear choice. If there will be a war in Taiwan Strait in the future, I think probably Japan and other countries, middle powers or US, they will make the same choice, although they have very close economic and trade tie with China. So this is just my personal observation. I would appreciate if Professor Nage and Professor Schneider can make any comments.
Well, in the case of the Ukraine, Russia crossed a red line. It invaded Ukraine and it's attacked civilians. I think that is a fundamental difference. And secondly, again, it goes back to the economic relationship with Russia. It's not substantial. It's actually, it's underwhelming, which allows the European Union and the United States to make a very different decision. In this region, the economic relationship is substantial with all of China's neighbors. They have a substantial amount to lose if there is a conflict between China. And at this stage, China hasn't crossed the red line. And let me give you some examples. The Uyghur re-education camps, that hasn't been a red line for European and American and Japanese businesses. The end of the one country, two systems in Hong Kong has not been a red line. The economic coercion against Australia, South Korea, Japan, Canada, or diplomatic or hostage diplomacy, these haven't been red lines to shift the position of Western countries and Western businesses. Disney actually made a movie in Xinjiang province, knowing full well that the re-education camps were happening because they prioritize profit. The question is will there be a red line that, for example, China crosses in this region that will shift the political calculus of businesses in Western countries? I think it's Taiwan, but it's really an open question at this particular time. What is the red line? It sure isn't the South China Sea. It sure isn't Hong Kong. It sure isn't human rights. Is it Taiwan? And that goes back to the very first question. Will there be a war over Taiwan? If there's a war over Taiwan, I'm afraid that's going to be a cascade of economic disaster and probably a conflict that will cascade into something much more serious. Professor Sanderschneider?
No, I absolutely agree. And that is the positive message to the people in Taiwan. As I said at the beginning, I think for the time being, they can feel comparatively safe not to be attacked from the People's Republic of China. Stephen, I hope you are right to say that economic relations are too important with China to prevent any kind of military clash, even on red lines like Taiwan. What I do remember, however, is that we had similar important economic relations between Great Britain and Germany before the First World War, and still the war happened. So this is what Zhang Zhaoting tried to express. There is no absolute guarantee that things might not happen. It is perhaps less probable or less feasible, but it could still happen in a true worst scenario, as we have seen it. And I have been watching all these assessments of what will Russia do towards Ukraine. And most people had extremely rational arguments for Russia not to attack. And in the end, an irrational president did it. And look at, you mentioned Donald Trump, the master of diplomacy in the White House. If you could even have a crazy president in the United States, and he could come back, as we know. And just imagine for a moment, in the present situation, Donald Trump being president of the United States. What about the unity of NATO? What about the unity of the West? Everything for a moment, what is possible for a moment, would probably not be possible with him in the office. So there are many, many risks also in individual power positions. But generally speaking, I would agree with what you said, yeah.
I think one more aspect that we haven't discussed is, despite the disastrous COVID response of the United States, it is the first economy to emerge out that has grown last year. It'll have full employment. It has pretty much full employment. Its population continues to increase. It continues to be innovative. It continues to be able to lead, and we've seen this with Biden bringing together the European Union. This is a tremendous asset, and I think that this has surprised many in Zhongnanhai of how easily the United States can rebound from crisis. And as Professor Sanderschneider mentioned, we could have another Trump, and there's a possibility in 2024, a Trump or a Trump-like figure.
Yes.
And this is a concern. But one aspect of the United States over its post-World War II history is its incredible elasticity and ability to recreate itself, to become more influential. And I think that the Biden election, the AUKUS agreement, the strengthening of the Quad, the diplomatic cooperation back against Russia is a message to our Chinese friends that the United States has incredible assets to bring to the floor, which will shape how China thinks about Taiwan and other issues within the region. And as Peter Zihan, writes in the Accidental Superpower, which is a great read, although it's a bit shallow, but it's a great read. The United States has two great friends, the Canadians and the Mexicans. And then it has the Atlantic and the Pacific. Mm-hmm. And most of its trade is in North America. And it has allies around the world. It's energy independent, and it's home to the most innovative and richest businesses on the planet. This gives it unique advantages in terms of competing with China and making strong partnerships in the region that I think will shape the decisions in Beijing moving forward.
So yeah, I think the discussion is exciting. Yeah, just now we have analyzed the positions of middle powers. Probably we should also analyze the preference and positions of leaders like President Xi and Vladimir Putin. So for the Ukrainian war, I think it's quite clear for Vladimir Putin that his geopolitical ambition is much more important than the economic situation of Russia. I think he has predicted that the Western countries will impose very strict economic sanctions against Russia after the invasion. But still, he has made that decision, maybe catastrophic, but he has made a clear choice. For Chinese leader, I think his mentality is probably similar. He is one strategist. Okay, so he's one strategist with great ambition. For him, the political objective is obviously more important than economic consideration. So we have seen over the past 10 years, he has made a lot of decisions, a lot of policies. For example, in China, digital companies are being pressured, okay, and many companies like after school education, like internet entertainment companies, actually they are very important for Chinese economy because they are creating a lot of jobs, but they have been under attack by the government because the government has different priority, mainly from political perspective rather than economic consideration. For the current Chinese leadership, I think it's quite clear. Politics is much more important than economics. And the Indo-Pacific strategy is a huge geopolitical threat for Chinese leaders. So in order to counter this geopolitical threat, I think they are willing to sacrifice Chinese economy. This is from Chinese side. So I think the war in Ukraine is really a game changer, especially for Germany. Germany has made a U-turn for its security policy. So I think Germany is trying to rearm itself. In the past, the debate about economic cooperation with Russia is always fierce, but now the decision is very easy for them, very easy. And it's based on consensus of German politicians and the public. This is my observation.
It's quite interesting to think about, Xiaoting, though, is that China continues to pick partners that are not exactly reliable. The North Koreans are not the best neighbors. They were testing nuclear weapons in northeastern Korea, which affected Jilin province and the northeastern provinces of China. Its presence and its behavior is detrimental to China. The decision by Putin to invade Ukraine, I do not think is in China's interests, but they are trying to deal with the reality that the invasion goes against their fundamental principles about the United Nations being the arbiter of international disputes and also sovereignty issues, non-interference. It seems that they're picking the wrong team in terms of trying to achieve their national interests. And the Ukraine incident is further, from my standpoint, demonstrated that China has problems with its allies or its partners. And the kind of relationships they have are complicated and unpredictable from the Chinese leader's standpoint, and not the preferred kind of relationships they would like to have.
If there is no more question, I think we can finalize today's discussion. I really appreciate the presentation from Professor Nagi. For the Chinese participants of today's session, if you are interested in Wenshe, you can scan the QR code of my background. And for non-Chinese friends, if you are interested in our activities in the future events, you can subscribe our newsletter, wenshe.substack.com. And thank you very much. I really appreciate your participation, especially for Professor Nagi. I think you are really busy, and I really appreciate your presentation. I enjoyed today's presentation and discussion, which has inspired me. Thanks again.
Thank you very much to you for organizing this. Je remercie tout le monde. Dankeschön. Friends from China, and I look forward to engaging with all of you soon. Do get in contact, and again, this is called the Literary Society, Wenshen, and we're here to be thinkers and friends, and I hope we can continue these kinds of relationships. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and good night.